Looking ahead from the middle of the 18th century, that's after a half a century during which the population of British North America doubled, Benjamin Franklin speculated that by 1850, the greatest number of Englishmen will be on this side of the Atlantic. And he said, what an accession of power to the British Empire, by sea as well as by land. What an increase of trade and navigation. What numbers of ships and seamen. Now, he didn't anticipate that there would be any change in the political connection between these parts of the empire, but expected them fully to remain bound together. But what changed in the 1760s was that the British Parliament took a greater hand in trying to govern the various parts of the empire, and this upset the established practices in each of these very different colonies in North America. Colonies which had governed themselves now, in some cases, for almost 2 centuries, with very little interference from across the ocean. Now, the colonies of North America are very different places. From the British point of view, the most important Western Hemisphere colonies were Barbados and Jamaica, which produced real wealth for the empire, the sugar islands of the West Indies. That would be the focus of British interest in the Americas. Now, if we move north and just look at these different places, and I know members come from these different places, so I hope I'm not giving too much away or misrepresenting these various interesting parts of North America, the newest of the British North American colonies, of course, was Georgia. I know there are Georgians here. And Georgia had been established both to be a buffer between South Carolina and Spanish Florida, and to give British merchants a competitive entree into trade with the Creeks and the Cherokee, rivaling the Spanish merchants who were in places like Pensacola and New Orleans, and also as a New World refuge where the poor of England and the indebted could regenerate themselves in the New World. However, England's destitute arriving in Georgia wondered why they could not regenerate themselves better by enslaving others, as their neighbors in South Carolina did. And the philanthropic sponsors of Georgia resisted this until relenting. And by the middle decades of the century, about half of Georgia's population of about 30,000 people were enslaved on the rice plantations. Now, it wasn't philanthropists, but Barbadian and Jamaican sugar planters who established South Carolina toward the end of the 17th century. And South Carolina was unique at the time of the Revolution in that 6 out of every 10 people was actually enslaved on the rice plantations along the coast. That's more people than lived in Rhode Island or Delaware or New Hampshire. And Charlestown in South Carolina, then called Charlestown, was actually the only urban center south of Philadelphia. And many of the gentry would retire to Charlestown during the miserable, sickly summer months, or else they would retreat to Newport in Rhode Island or even to England. And the planters of South Carolina were wary both of this large enslaved labor force, but also of the Scots-Irish and German immigrants who were rapidly filling the backcountry of South Carolina, moving into these societies, creating these societies that were very different from the coastal world of the rice plantations. Scots-Irish, Scottish Highlanders, Germans were also flooding into North Carolina, into the interior, the Piedmont country, quadrupling North Carolina's population in the years between 1750 and the time of the Revolution, when North Carolina was both the fastest growing and the 4th largest North American colony, with 200,000 people. And in fact, in the decade of the Revolution, another 90,000, that's more than lived in New Hampshire, would arrive in the backcountry, settling on the borders between the Cherokee, Catawba, and Lumbee, and ignoring the pretended cultural superiority of the tobacco gentry on the coast. Tobacco dominated both Virginia and Maryland, which were among the earliest of Britain's colonies, and by the time of the Revolution, by the late 18th century, they were mature plantation societies, and Virginia was by far the largest British North American colony in both land and population. It was home now to 500,000 people, 200,000 of them enslaved. And the world's tobacco market by this point was glutted, and the tidewater soil was so depleted that the planters of Virginia were looking west beyond the mountains for new land to plant and to sell. And the ambitious Virginians built a fort where the Monongahela and the Allegheny rivers formed the Ohio River. And this was actually land that lay within the charter claims of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, of course, the thriving colony along the Delaware that had been founded by Quakers who were determined to be fair to the native people. And Pennsylvania's merchants at this point are defying New York's claim to a monopoly on the Indian trade, and they're negotiating their own deals with the Tuscarora and the Delaware, and they're also defying Virginia's claims to the West. Pennsylvania was less religiously rigid than the New England colonies, which I'll be discussing in a moment, and it had better soil and a better climate than New England did. And this drew in more immigrants. By 1750, that is the year Franklin is speculating on the population of British North America over the next 100 years, Philadelphia was the second busiest port in the British Empire, as well as one of the largest cities in the British Empire. And it was sending out corn and grain to feed the laborers in Barbados and Jamaica, also bringing in English, German, Scots-Irish, Scottish immigrants to farm their own fertile land in the Delaware and Susquehanna River valleys. The Dutch had established the New Netherlands back in the early 17th century as a trading base for trade with the Iroquois, the most powerful Native American group in North America. But then the British seized it in about 1660, renamed it New York, but they retained the Dutch trade model. The lower Hudson River Valley, the area around Manhattan, was a provisioning ground to supply the trading post at Albany. In 1776, Henry Knox speculated that Albany would have to become the capital of North America because it was such an important place. New York had a certain idea of its own hegemony, which crosses over into northern New Jersey and along both shores of Long Island Sound and as far north as Lake Champlain, although New York's neighbors didn't always recognize her imperial dreams. Now, New England had been founded by religious dissenters, and these colonies were culturally homogeneous. Then they prospered through trade, turning the forests of New England into ships and barrels to carry the empire's goods from the West Indies to New England and beyond. Codfish caught in the cold coastal waters would be dried and salted on the rocky shores, and they would feed the enslaved people of the West Indies. The very term Yankee came from a Dutch term meaning a hard bargainer. These New Englanders, who had more power to govern themselves than any other people in the British Empire, held fast to the faith of their fathers. The popular hymn of 1770, "Let tyrants shake their iron rod and slavery clank her galling chains, we fear them not, we trust in God, New England's God forever reigns," rang out in the churches of New England, but probably did not have as much resonance further south, where New England's God wouldn't be as feared or celebrated.